You can't say anything. Richard Hawthorne's voice echoed through the glass-walled boardroom, crisp and commanding, the polished marble floor reflecting the fluorescent lights above. Emily Parker's fingers tightened around the folder she carried, her knuckles pale, pulse hammering against her wrists as the room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with anticipation, every assistant frozen mid-motion, pens paused over tablets, eyes darting between the two figures at the center of the room. The CEO towering in his tailored navy suit, a subtle smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, exuding effortless control while Emily, 17, dressed in the understated gray uniform of the family's household staff, stepped forward, shoulders squared despite the chill in the room, a bead of sweat tracing her temple, her heart racing with both fear and resolve. The folder containing crucial emails and handwritten notes about an internal misstep that could upend a critical merger, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the executives seated in tense silence, each one waiting for the storm to break. She inhaled deeply, letting the faint scent of polished wood and the subtle tang of the city outside anchor her, then spoke, her voice steady, carrying through the cavernous space with a quiet authority that demanded attention. Sir, the documents you're about to sign contain a hidden clause that could expose a betrayal within your own team. And immediately, heads turned sharply, eyes widening in disbelief as murmurs rippled across the room, pens clattering softly onto glossy conference tables, the hum of the air conditioning suddenly noticeable in the sudden hush. Richard's brow furrowed, a slight crease forming as he leaned forward, scrutinizing her every move, the smirk fading into a thin line, tension tightening like a coiled spring between them. Emily's pulse raced, yet her voice never wavered, the weight of knowledge and years of observation lending her words a gravity that seemed to freeze time, every footstep she had taken to reach this moment echoing in her mind, the fluorescent lights catching the silver edges of the documents, reflecting shards of possibility and consequence. And as she held the folder out, just an inch above the sleek surface of the table, the room collectively leaned in, breath held, hearts quickened, the perfect storm of revelation and fear swirling in the polished air, a single, quiet challenge hanging in the space between Emily and Richard, daring him to acknowledge the truth or dismiss it, knowing that either choice would ripple through every corner of his empire and leave a mark that could never be erased. The conference room remained suspended in tense silence, the hum of the ventilation system echoing faintly against the high glass walls, casting elongated reflections across the polished marble floor, every pen paused midair, every executive leaning forward as if drawn magnetically to the moment, and Emily Parker, her eyes scanning the table lined with crisp folders and untouched notepads, felt the weight of expectation pressing evenly on her shoulders, her heart a steady drumbeat against her ribs, the scent of fresh ink and faint citrus from the nearby window cleaner mingling in the air, creating a sensory anchor as she set the folder carefully on the table, letting it slide just slightly forward, a deliberate gesture that demanded acknowledgement. Richard Hawthorne, seated at the head of the table, his tailored navy suit immaculate, adjusted his tie slowly, the subtle creases around his eyes deepening as he absorbed the gravity of Emily's words, the faint click of his polished shoes against the marble marking each second that stretched longer than the last. The executives exchanging glances, eyebrows raised, their lips pressed thin in anticipation, and Emily, feeling the tension sharpen around her like a blade, took a controlled breath, her chest rising deliberately, her hands relaxed but firm on the folder, as she continued in a calm, measured tone, outlining the specific clauses and discrepancies she had uncovered, each word clear and deliberate, her voice cutting through the thick, sterile air, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the silver binder clips and glass water pitchers on the table, emphasizing the sharp angles of the room and the intensity of the moment. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle frown crossing his face as he leaned back in his chair, evaluating every nuance, his mind racing through scenarios, consequences, and reputations. The quiet shuffle of papers from a nervous assistant, the only sound apart from the soft hum of the lights, and Emily, sensing the shift, did not flinch, instead letting her gaze meet his directly, her expression calm yet insistent, projecting a quiet authority that belied her age and position. The folder now opened to the exact pages that outlined the hidden irregularities, the ink crisp against the heavy stock paper, her fingertips tracing the margins as she emphasized each point with subtle gestures. The executives leaning in closer, some tilting their heads, others exchanging whispered words, all trying to reconcile the shock of the revelation with their assumptions about Emily's role and status. The room charged with unspoken anticipation, every heartbeat amplified by the sudden awareness that the balance of power could shift in the next few moments. The polished surfaces reflecting the collective tension, the glass walls, trapping the light in long, stretching bands across the floor, casting Emily's figure in a sharp, defined silhouette. And as Richard inhaled slowly, the creak of his leather chair the only audible sound, a quiet acknowledgement flickered in his eyes, a hint of reconsideration, the once unassailable authority subtly tempered, the executives leaning forward in rapt attention, the room still suspended in this delicate equilibrium. Every individual acutely aware that the next words from Emily Parker could redefine the outcome entirely, leaving the space alive with the electricity of truth poised to reshape the hierarchy within those high glass walls. Emily Parker leaned closer to the table, her eyes scanning the lines of the open binder, each page meticulously annotated with her observations, the faint scent of paper and ink mixing with the sterile air of the boardroom. And Richard Hawthorne, still seated at the head of the table, ran a hand over his chin, the polished wood beneath his fingers smooth and cold, his expression shifting subtly as he processed the implications of her words, the fluorescent lights above catching the gold cufflinks on his sleeves, casting tiny reflections across the room. While the executives exchanged glances, the tension palpable, their collective breath held as they waited for the next revelation. Emily's voice remained steady, deliberate, each syllable carefully measured, explaining the connections between the overlooked clauses and the potential consequences for the company, her hands moving only slightly to emphasize key points without disrupting the flow of the documents. The soft scratch of a pen occasionally breaking the quiet rhythm, a reminder of the fragile equilibrium in the room, and the hum of the air conditioning seemed to intensify the focus on her words, creating an almost cinematic stillness around the high-backed chairs and the long glass table. Richard's eyes narrowed, the corners crinkling as he leaned forward, the chair creaking ever so slightly under the shift of his weight, absorbing the weight of the evidence, the subtle tension in his jawline betraying the surprise he had not expected. And Emily, sensing the shift, maintained her gaze, projecting confidence without arrogance, the binder held firmly before her, the edges of the pages reflecting the cool light, the polished floor beneath her feet mirroring her small but determined silhouette. As she continued, the executives leaned forward, some resting elbows lightly on the table, others pressing fingertips to lips in silent contemplation, all trying to reconcile the authority of Richard with the undeniable clarity and precision of Emily's presentation. The room filled with unspoken anticipation, the air thick with the subtle scent of cologne, faint coffee, and the crisp winter air from the slightly open window, blending to create an atmosphere of heightened awareness. A quiet shuffle of papers, the soft tap of a tablet, and the gentle murmur of a whisper among a few assistants punctuated the silence. Yet Emily's calm persisted, her voice unwavering as she detailed the implications, drawing lines between the facts and consequences, illustrating each point with concise logic, her presence commanding attention through intellect and poise rather than volume. Richard's brow lifted slightly, a small shift in posture, indicating the first cracks of doubt, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The polished surfaces reflecting the intensity of the moment, the high glass walls trapping light and sound alike, creating a cocoon around the confrontation. And as Emily closed the binder with a deliberate, soft snap, the subtle echo filling the space, every person present felt the gravity of the revelation settle over them like a tangible weight, the unspoken realization that the quiet maid's daughter had unveiled a truth capable of altering the balance of power, leaving the boardroom suspended between disbelief and acknowledgement, a delicate anticipation lingering, as if the next moment could tip the scales entirely. Richard Hawthorne leaned back slightly in his chair, the polished oak beneath his hands cold and rigid, his eyes tracing the precise lines of the folder Emily Parker had just presented, every page a testament to careful observation and unwavering attention. And Emily, standing with her shoulders squared and breath measured, felt the shift in the room as the executives, previously rigid and aloof, now leaned in closer. Their expressions a mix of incredulity and cautious curiosity, the soft hum of the air conditioning filling the otherwise silent space, punctuated only by the subtle scratch of a pen as one assistant nervously adjusted a note. The sunlight streaming through the tall glass windows casting long, angular shadows across the marble floor, illuminating Emily's determined stance. The gray uniform she wore absorbing the light and accentuating the contrast between her modest appearance and the authority she now commanded through knowledge alone. She gestured gently to a specific paragraph, her fingers tracing the margins, her voice calm but deliberate, carrying over the stillness, outlining the implications of the hidden clause with clarity and precision, each word resonating through the room, creating a tension that pressed against the walls and the tall, silent windows, while Richard's gaze followed every movement, the slight furrow in his brow deepening, revealing the first signs of uncertainty as the immovable certainty of his authority began to bend under the weight of undeniable truth. And the executives, sensing the subtle tremor in the CEO's demeanor, exchanged furtive glances, the soft shuffle of papers and the faint tapping of a tablet adding to the layered soundscape of anticipation and suspense. Emily paused briefly, letting the gravity of her words sink in, her eyes sweeping across the faces that had once dismissed her, observing the almost imperceptible changes in posture, the tightening of hands on folders, the shift in breathing, a silent acknowledgement of the impact of her intervention, while the fluorescent lights above reflected off polished surfaces, creating a lattice of light and shadow that mirrored the complex interplay of power and revelation unfolding before them. And Richard, slowly adjusting his tie, his gaze narrowing, allowed a single exhalation, measured and controlled, to escape, the subtle sound amplifying in the suspended silence, signaling a reconsideration, a momentary pause in the calculated certainty that had dominated the room moments before. And Emily, sensing the opportunity, maintained her composure, her stance unwavering, the folder now resting on the table like a bridge between revelation and resolution, every inch of her posture communicating confidence without arrogance, intellect without pretension, the quiet strength in her presence a palpable force in the polished, sunlit room, leaving every observer aware that the balance of control had shifted ever so slightly, a delicate tension poised on the cusp of transformation, hinting at consequences yet unseen. The room suspended in a state of anticipation as the next moment held the potential to redefine relationships, authority, and the future of the decisions at hand. Emily Parker felt a subtle shift in the energy of the room as Richard Hawthorne's eyes lingered on the open folder, the polished mahogany table reflecting the morning light that streamed through the tall windows, casting long, angled shadows across the marble floor, the air thick with a mixture of anticipation and the faint scent of coffee and citrus polish, the executives leaning slightly forward, pens still poised over notebooks, breaths quiet, yet collective, each person aware that the next words could alter the course of decisions made within these walls. She straightened her back, shoulders relaxed yet firm, letting her gaze meet Richard's directly, a silent assertion of confidence that came not from title or position, but from meticulous observation and unshakable truth. And as she began to outline the context behind the documents, her voice even and deliberate, articulating the history, intentions, and potential consequences with clarity and precision, the room seemed to contract, each individual drawn in by the cadence of her explanation, the slight hum of the ventilation accentuating the tension, the reflective surfaces of the table and the high glass walls amplifying the gravity of the moment, the faint click of a pen or the soft rustle of a paper, the only interruptions to the otherwise profound stillness. Richard's hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, fingertips brushing the smooth surface, his expression transitioning from incredulity to focused contemplation, the subtle narrowing of his eyes indicating the processing of each revelation, while Emily, sensing the subtle cracks in his certainty, continued without hesitation, her motions controlled and purposeful, gesturing only slightly to highlight key sections, the ink crisp against the thick pages, the margins annotated with her own concise notes, every word building a narrative of careful analysis and unwavering integrity, and the executives, witnessing the courage and precision with which the youngest member of the household staff presented information that challenged the foundation of long-held assumptions, leaned in with a mixture of surprise and newfound respect, their whispered exchanges curtailed by the weight of Emily's presence and the undeniable clarity of her findings. The sunlight shifted slightly, catching on Richard's cufflinks and the edges of the binder, illuminating the careful detailing of the evidence, each reflection reinforcing the sense of scrutiny and focus in the room, and Emily's steady breath, her poised stance, and measured words created a rhythm that contrasted sharply with the initial tension, allowing the executives to absorb the information, reconsider their positions, and acknowledge the reality before them. The high ceilings and expansive windows containing the intensity of the moment while simultaneously amplifying the psychological stakes. The polished marble floor echoing the subtle sounds of movement and drawing attention to the meticulous control Emily exerted over her own presence. And in that elongated pause, as Richard slowly lifted the folder, tracing the lines with his eyes, a flicker of recognition passed across his face, a quiet acknowledgement of her insight and the potential shift in authority, leaving the room suspended on the edge of transformation. Every individual acutely aware that the dynamics of power and perception had already begun to change within these walls. Emily Parker took a deliberate step forward, the soft click of her shoes echoing lightly against the polished marble floor, the sunlight streaming through the high glass windows casting long, subtle shadows across the room, highlighting the meticulous arrangement of folders, laptops, and pens that had been poised in tense anticipation since the beginning of the discussion. And Richard Hawthorne, seated at the head of the table, straightened in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the polished surface as he absorbed the implications of each point she outlined, the faint creak of leather adding a quiet rhythm to the otherwise still environment. Emily's eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture and attention among the executives, their subtle nods and exchanges of glances indicating the impact of her precise observations. The carefully documented evidence laid out before them commanding attention and respect, a quiet authority emanating from her measured tone and deliberate gestures, the soft rustle of pages accentuating the gravity of the revelations she was presenting, and the high ceilings and tall windows seemed to amplify the significance of the moment, each reflection of light creating a dynamic interplay across the polished surfaces and the confident stance of the young woman at the center of the room. Her voice remained calm, yet insistent, articulating the connections and consequences with clarity and purpose, weaving together facts and observations into a cohesive narrative that left no room for ambiguity, each sentence reinforcing her credibility, and Richard, absorbing every word, allowed the subtle furrow of his brow to deepen, a flicker of contemplation crossing his features as he began to reassess his assumptions, the faint tension in his jawline betraying the inner processing of information that challenged his authority and expectations. The executives around the table remained captivated, leaning slightly forward, their attention focused entirely on the dialogue unfolding between Emily and Richard, the subtle hum of the air conditioning providing a steady backdrop as the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional tap of a pen punctuated the silence, heightening the focus on the clarity and precision of her presentation, the sunlight catching on the edges of the folders and metallic objects, reflecting the intensity of the moment. Emily held her posture with confidence, shoulders relaxed but firm, hands resting lightly on the open binder, her gaze unwavering, projecting a quiet power that resonated throughout the room, the polished marble floor mirroring her composed reflection, while Richard's subtle movements and shifting expression indicated the gradual acceptance of the validity of her findings, a slow, deliberate recognition that the information she presented could reshape decisions and influence outcomes. The room held in suspended anticipation, each individual acutely aware of the transformative moment unfolding. the balance of authority beginning to tilt subtly in favor of the insight and clarity that Emily Parker brought into the space, leaving a lingering sense of possibility in the unspoken, understanding that the next moments could redefine the dynamic entirely. Richard Hawthorne's hand hovered just above the folder, his polished cufflinks catching the sunlight that spilled across the marble floor, and he let out a slow, deliberate exhale, the weight of realization settling across his shoulders as the room remained completely still, every executive frozen mid-note, pens and tablets forgotten, eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation, and Emily Parker, standing with a quiet composure, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the binder, felt the subtle change in the energy, the air thick with anticipation as her calm voice continued to delineate the connections and consequences, each sentence deliberate, precise, threading together facts that had been overlooked by those with far more authority, her presence commanding attention not through volume but through clarity, her posture unwavering, eyes meeting Richard's without a hint of intimidation, projecting confidence born from meticulous preparation and unwavering truth. The sunlight shifted across the room, casting angular reflections off the glass walls and polished wood surfaces, highlighting the intricate interplay between authority and insight, and the executives, previously aloof and detached, leaned forward instinctively, their quiet murmurs suppressed by the gravity of Emily's delivery, the subtle scrape of a chair leg, the soft tap of a pen on a notebook, the faint whisper of papers adjusting under careful hands, all punctuating the tension that hung in the air, emphasizing the seriousness of the moment and the undeniable precision of her observations, while Richard's gaze traveled slowly over the documents, absorbing each annotation, his mind tracing the ramifications with a newfound caution, the furrow in his brow deepening as he recognized the depth of her understanding and the validity of her perspective. Emily's breath remained steady, her voice measured, her gestures subtle but intentional, emphasizing key points with a controlled elegance, the binder open before her, pages crisp and meticulously arranged, the margins lined with notes and evidence, the sunlight glinting off the edges, reinforcing the focus and intensity of the moment, and Richard, still seated but shifting slightly forward, allowed a subtle nod, an acknowledgement of the impact of her words. The room's atmosphere taut with unspoken realization, the executives following suit, glances exchanged, a quiet recognition of the significance of what had just been revealed. The balance of authority subtly tipping as the weight of truth laid out with precision and calm began to redefine the hierarchy within the space. Every subtle movement and reflection amplified in the high-ceilinged, glass-encased boardroom, leaving a lingering anticipation in the air as though the next words, the next motion, could fully transform the understanding of power, insight, and the path forward for everyone present. Emily Parker straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, the subtle sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows casting long reflections across the polished marble floor, highlighting the clean lines of the boardroom and the meticulous arrangement of laptops, folders, and glass water pitchers. The air thick with a combination of anticipation, faint citrus polish, and the low hum of the ventilation system. As the executives remained frozen, their attention entirely on her, the pens hovering midair, eyes locked on the unfolding exchange, and Richard Hawthorne, seated at the head of the table, leaned slightly forward, fingertips grazing the polished wood, his expression a complex blend of contemplation and curiosity, the tight crease between his brows softening for the first time since the meeting began, and Emily, sensing the subtle shift, allowed a slight movement of her hand toward the open folder, each page carefully displayed, her voice calm, yet commanding, articulating the interwoven details of the hidden irregularities, connecting them to the potential implications with precision and clarity, every word measured to convey authority without arrogance. The executives leaning ever so slightly, heads tilting, absorbing the nuance and insight. The room feeling simultaneously larger and more intimate as the high ceilings and glass walls contained the intensity of the moment while amplifying its significance. And as Emily paused for a moment, letting the impact of her observations settle in, the silence was filled with a profound weight, the faint scratch of a pen, or the gentle adjustment of a notebook, the only audible sounds punctuating the stillness. Each person acutely aware that the balance of influence was quietly shifting. The previously unquestioned authority of Richard now tempered by the unassailable logic and composure of the maid's daughter, and the sunlight caught the edge of the binder, glinting softly against the polished surfaces, emphasizing the gravity of what had been revealed, the reflective floor mirroring the subtle movement of her feet as she maintained eye contact, projecting unwavering confidence, while Richard's posture straightened imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing with recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of her diligence and clarity resonating in the room, the executives' attention locked, every subtle gesture and nuanced inflection in her tone reinforcing the significance of her message. The room filled with the weight of realization, each individual silently recalibrating their assumptions, as Emily Parker, calm and deliberate, maintained control over the narrative of truth, poised on the edge of revelation, the delicate tension lingering, suggesting that the next words or motions could decisively transform the power dynamic in the boardroom, leaving every observer suspended in anticipation of the consequences yet to unfold. Emily Parker held her gaze steadily on Richard Hawthorne, the sunlight catching the edges of her open binder, illuminating the carefully annotated pages filled with notes and highlighted passages, and the polished marble floor reflected the elongated shadows of both figures, creating a visual tension that mirrored the unspoken stakes in the room. The air thick with anticipation and the subtle scent of citrus polish blending with the faint aroma of coffee lingering from earlier, while the executives remained still, leaning slightly forward, eyes fixed on her every movement, their pens hovering above notebooks as though waiting for a signal, and Richard, seated at the head of the table, allowed his expression to soften just enough to show contemplation, a subtle shift in posture betraying the first cracks in the armor of unshakable authority, his fingers brushing lightly over the polished surface of the mahogany table as he absorbed the precision and clarity of Emily's presentation, the quiet hum of the ventilation system underscoring the gravity of the unfolding moment. Emily continued, her voice calm and deliberate, articulating the connections between overlooked clauses and the potential ramifications with measured confidence, each sentence building upon the previous, her hands moving slightly to emphasize critical points without breaking the composed rhythm, and the sunlight shifted across the room, glinting off metallic objects, the glass water pitchers, and the edge of the binder, creating subtle reflections that danced across the polished surfaces, heightening the visual tension while reinforcing the focus on the unfolding revelation, the executives exchanging small, almost imperceptible glances, their curiosity and cautious admiration growing as they processed the depth of her insights, the room itself seemingly holding its breath as every word resonated, highlighting the quiet power of methodical observation and unwavering attention to detail. Richard's gaze lingered on specific passages, his jaw tightening in concentration, a slow, deliberate breath signaling internal processing, his once absolute certainty now tempered by Emily's methodical exposition, and Emily, sensing the subtle acknowledgement of her authority, maintained her stance, shoulders squared, chin lifted, hands resting lightly on the binder, her presence commanding attention without dominance, projecting a quiet assurance that had shifted the dynamics within the room, the marble floor reflecting her composed figure, while the sunlight accentuated the tension in the air, every surface and reflection amplifying the intensity of the exchange. And as the executives absorbed the implications of the revelations, their quiet murmurings replaced by attentive silence, the balance of perceived power subtly tilting, leaving the boardroom suspended in a state of anticipation, each individual acutely aware that the careful exposition and undeniable clarity brought forth by Emily Parker could decisively influence the decisions, reputations, and future actions of all present, the atmosphere thick with potential, and poised on the cusp of transformation, the next words or gestures promising to reshape the understanding of authority, insight, and truth within the high glass walls. The moment hung suspended as Emily Parker carefully laid out the final pages of her meticulously organized binder, the sunlight slicing through the high glass windows and glinting off the polished marble floor, the reflections creating a lattice of light that mirrored the intricate network of evidence she had uncovered. And Richard Hawthorne, seated at the head of the table, leaned forward slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the mahogany surface, his eyes scanning each line of her notes with a measured intensity, the faint crease of his brow deepening as he absorbed the gravity of the revelations, the executives surrounding the table leaning in as well, pens hovering above notebooks, the subtle shuffle of paper and occasional tap of a tablet amplifying the concentrated silence, the air thick with anticipation and the faint scent of citrus polish, punctuated by the soft hum of the ventilation system. Emily's voice remained calm, precise, deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of her preparation and insight, articulating the interconnections between the clauses and their potential consequences with clarity, her hands moving slightly to emphasize key points without breaking the rhythm. The sunlight catching on the metallic edges of the binder and pens, drawing subtle highlights across the polished surfaces, while the shadows cast by the tall windows lengthened and shifted, echoing the tension in the room, the executives exchanging glances, silent acknowledgement of the accuracy and impact of her observations, their initial disbelief slowly giving way to measured curiosity and cautious respect. Richard's expression shifted imperceptibly, the tight line of his jaw softening as he absorbed the meticulous logic, his fingers lightly drumming against the smooth wood, the faint sound amplified in the quiet room, the high ceilings containing the gravity of the moment, and Emily, noticing the subtle acknowledgement, maintained her poised stance, her gaze steady, projecting confidence through controlled body language, the binder open before her, pages crisp and aligned, the annotations clear and intentional, every word and gesture reinforcing her authority through preparation and precision rather than volume or force, the polished floor reflecting her composed silhouette, the executives leaning forward almost imperceptibly, each subtle movement reinforcing the quiet transformation of the room's dynamic. As she concluded this segment, allowing the weight of the revelations to resonate, the sunlight shifted slightly, glinting off Richard's cufflinks and the edges of the papers, the reflections casting brief flickers across the room, emphasizing the subtle but profound shift in perception, the air seemingly holding its breath, the executives' murmurs fading as they focused fully on the implications, the balance of power subtly tilting as recognition of Emily's insight became undeniable, and the room, suspended in this charged stillness, waited collectively for the next movement, the next words, the next acknowledgement that would solidify the redefinition of authority and perception, leaving everyone acutely aware that the truth, carefully presented and calmly maintained, had begun to reshape the hierarchy within the glass-walled boardroom, the polished surfaces and angled sunlight emphasizing the gravity and clarity of the moment, a silent testament to preparation, courage, and unwavering attention to detail. Richard Hawthorne sat back in his chair, the polished wood beneath his hands cold and smooth, his gaze distant for a moment as if tracing through the maze of decisions and assumptions that had led him to this juncture, the sunlight streaming through the high glass windows illuminating the subtle creases around his eyes and the faint silver of his cufflinks, reflecting the quiet tension of the room, and Emily Parker, standing with her binder open and pages carefully spread, observed the subtle shift, the executives leaning forward, silent but attentive, sensing the weight of the unfolding moment, the soft hum of the ventilation system accentuating the concentrated stillness, every pen hovering above notebooks, every slight rustle of paper amplifying the gravity of the pause. Richard's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, fingertips brushing the smooth surface as his thoughts unraveled internally, the previously unassailable confidence tempered by the clarity and precision of Emily's exposition, the air thick with anticipation and the faint scent of citrus polish, and Emily maintained her composed posture, shoulders squared, chin lifted, hands steady on the binder, projecting an authority born from meticulous preparation and unshakable knowledge, her voice low and deliberate, articulating the implications of the findings with quiet insistence, each word connecting facts, evidence, and consequences, weaving a narrative of undeniable logic that captured the attention. of all present, the sunlight glinting off the metallic edges of pens and paper clips, casting fleeting reflections that seemed to emphasize the importance of each moment. The executives, previously skeptical, now exchanged subtle glances, the tension in their faces easing slightly as the precision of Emily's reasoning became unmistakable, the room holding a collective breath as Richard's expression slowly softened, his shoulders relaxing marginally, the faint crease of his brow remaining but now hinting at contemplation rather than rigid authority, his eyes scanning the documents again, tracing the lines of evidence with a newfound respect, each careful annotation and highlighted passage reinforcing the undeniable insight of the young woman before him. While Emily's steady gaze never wavered, her stance firm yet composed, projecting the quiet power of competence and integrity. The polished marble floor reflecting her silhouette, the high ceilings amplifying the significance of the moment, the glass walls containing the intensity and focus, every subtle sound, the shift of a chair, the rustle of a page, the quiet exhalation of breath, magnifying the weight of the revelation, and in that elongated, suspended pause, Richard's internal acknowledgement became visible, a silent recognition of her accuracy and diligence, the balance of authority subtly realigning, the executives observing, understanding that the shift was complete not through volume or assertion but through careful, unwavering demonstration of truth, leaving the room suspended in anticipation of the next steps, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the perspective and understanding of power within these walls had fundamentally changed. Emily Parker exhaled softly, allowing the weight of the room's attention to settle fully on her, the polished marble floor reflecting the angular beams of sunlight that streamed through the high windows, highlighting the precise organization of her open binder and the meticulous annotations that adorned each page, and Richard Hawthorne, seated at the head of the table, leaned forward slightly, his fingers brushing over the smooth surface of the mahogany desk as his eyes traced the interconnected evidence, the subtle tightening of his jaw giving way to a contemplative softness, the air around them thick with anticipation and the faint scent of coffee lingering alongside citrus polish, the executives leaning in, their collective focus sharpening as the clarity of her presentation resonated with undeniable authority, pens hovering above notebooks, the soft hum of the ventilation system accentuating the stillness, the polished surfaces and tall glass walls containing the tension while amplifying the gravity of the moment. Emily's voice remained calm and deliberate, each syllable precise and purposeful, articulating the additional layers of insight she had uncovered, the connections between overlooked details and the implications for the company, her gestures measured, emphasizing key points without disrupting the flow, the sunlight glinting off the metallic edges of paper clips and binder rings, creating subtle flickers across the room, reflecting the intensity and precision of her exposition, while Richard's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, his brow creasing in deep consideration, the faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead catching the light, signaling the internal process of weighing each revelation, and the executives, recognizing the depth and thoroughness of her presentation, shifted slightly in their seats, their attention fully captured, murmurs replaced by attentive silence, the subtle shuffle of paper and tap of a pen punctuating the concentrated quiet. Emily allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the combined evidence resonate, the room hanging in delicate equilibrium, and then she continued, weaving the connections together with steady articulation, projecting not only the factual truth but the meticulous care with which she had arrived at it, her posture unwavering, shoulders squared, chin lifted, hands resting lightly on the binder, the polished floor reflecting her composed silhouette, the high ceilings emphasizing the importance of her presence, and Richard, absorbing each point, allowed a subtle exhalation, the smallest acknowledgement of the impact of her clarity and diligence, the once rigid authority now softened by recognition of accuracy and insight, the executive's expressions revealing a mixture of surprise, respect, and cautious admiration, the subtle reflections of sunlight across the marble and glass underscoring the quiet transformation of the room's dynamic, leaving all present acutely aware that the demonstration of careful observation, measured delivery, and unshakable integrity had shifted the balance, the atmosphere suspended in anticipation of the next decisions and the realization that Emily Parker's clarity and poise had altered the understanding of influence, authority, and insight within the glass-walled boardroom. The polished surfaces capturing the delicate interplay of light, presence, and attention, leaving the moment charged with possibility and the quiet acknowledgement that truth, when presented with precision and courage, commanded recognition regardless of status. The boardroom remained enveloped in a profound stillness, the sunlight slanting through the tall windows and casting elongated, golden reflections across the polished marble floor, the glass walls trapping both the warmth of the light and the charged anticipation that lingered after Emily Parker's detailed exposition, and Richard Hawthorne, seated at the head of the table, finally allowed the corners of his mouth to soften slightly, a subtle nod of acknowledgement passing across his face as he traced the lines of the documents once more, his fingers resting lightly on the smooth mahogany surface, the executives around the table exchanging quiet, appreciative glances, their previous skepticism giving way to a newfound recognition of her diligence and precision, the faint hum of the ventilation system underscoring the intensity of the moment, every subtle sound, the shuffle of a notebook, the soft tap of a pen, the gentle creak of leather chairs, amplifying the gravity of the quiet revelation. Emily's posture remained composed, shoulders squared, chin lifted, her gaze steady and unwavering, hands resting lightly on the binder that had commanded attention and reshaped assumptions, the polished floor, reflecting her confident silhouette, the sunlight highlighting the meticulous arrangement of papers and annotations that had allowed her to present the truth with clarity and authority. And as she exhaled gently, letting the room absorb the significance of her presentation, the tension in the space softened, replaced with a quiet, contemplative focus, the executives leaning in just slightly, their attention fully captivated by the interplay of precision, preparation, and unshakable integrity that Emily had demonstrated, while Richard allowed a slow, deliberate breath to pass, his expression thoughtful, a mixture of respect, realization, and subtle admiration passing across his features, the polished surfaces capturing and reflecting the delicate interplay of light, shadow, and presence within the high-ceilinged, glass-encased room. For a moment, time seemed suspended, every individual attuned to the transformation that had quietly occurred, the balance of authority subtly shifting. The once rigid hierarchy now softened by recognition of competence, insight, and careful articulation, and Emily, standing calmly yet firmly at the center, projected a quiet power that transcended status, her measured voice and deliberate gestures having communicated a truth undeniable in clarity and weight, the sunlight catching the edges of the binder and metallic objects across the table, scattering subtle glimmers of light that danced across the polished surfaces, reinforcing the significance of the moment, the executive's subtle nods and attentive postures acknowledging the undeniable impact of her exposition. And as Richard's eyes met hers directly, a silent understanding passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that authority and respect could be earned through knowledge, integrity, and courage, leaving the room suspended in a poised equilibrium. The final reflection of sunlight across the marble and glass underscoring the quiet triumph of meticulous preparation and unwavering presence, the atmosphere charged with possibility, contemplation, and the lasting impression of Emily Parker's steadfast demonstration of truth and insight.